Well, folks, we have a really good show for you today because Jarrah is going to explain a few things about radiation and a few things about what they have discovered on the ISS, among other things. So, Jarrah, do you want to take it away?
Certainly. Last time I was on this show, we talked about how when I was doing my astrophysics course, we had the Geiger counter and the different radioactive sources and the different materials to use, the aluminium piece, the paper piece, and the lead piece. Just a very quick reminder, when we did the test with the alpha particles, so first of all, we needed to control, we needed to do some tests without the shielding. We put the alpha emitter in path of the detector. We got something like 2,000 counts per second. Okay, we put the paper piece in the path between the alpha emitter and the Geiger counter, and we found that, okay, that reduces the count rates to about 2 counts per second, as what's suggested by all the textbook diagrams. But when we swapped the paper piece out and put the aluminium piece in its place, we were suddenly getting a much higher radiation count than what we got with no shielding. Okay, so what happened there was the alpha particles, they were fragmenting, they were hitting the aluminium and they were fragmenting into a spray of secondary particles, and that's what the detector was picking up. Now, in fact, there's actually this article here from New Scientist. The article, it's called ISS Shield is Disappointing. Radiation inside the ISS and on the now defunct Mir is caused by the fast, heavy ions that make up the cosmic rays and collide with the aluminium hull, releasing a shower of secondary particles into the living quarters. To mitigate this effect, the ISS has been fitted with additional polyethylene shielding that contains lighter atomic nuclei, which are less likely to throw out neutrons when hit with cosmic rays. So basically what they're saying here is when they use the aluminium, right, even though my experiment that concerned alpha particles, the same principle applies to cosmic rays or heavy cosmic rays. When a heavy particle impacts the aluminium on the ISS, it fragments into a spray of secondary particles, which obviously we need additional shielding underneath that to absorb this kind of secondary radiation. What has happened on the ISS, obviously the radiation there isn't sufficient to kill an astronaut in the short term, because obviously it's been filtered out by the Van Allen belt and magnetic field and whatnot. Well, this demonstrates the exact same thing that I witnessed in my physics class. When we put the aluminium in the path of these heavy particles, they get fragmented into secondary particles, and that creates an even worse radiation count than that was outside the craft.
Is that the breaking radiation referred to as Bremsstrahlung?
Yeah, Bremsstrahlung, it typically refers to secondary X-rays when electrons are stopped in shielding, but it can apply to all types of secondary radiation. Basically, in the case of particles, right, we got alpha particles is essentially 2 neutrons and 2 protons joined together. When we refer to heavy ions, we're talking about the much heavier particles. In astrophysics, we call anything that's heavier than helium, we call those metals. Everything with atomic number greater than 2 is considered a metal in astronomical terms. But the point is that when these heavy particles impact the aluminium, it gets shredded up into these different fragments of smaller particles, and they get basically a much higher field inside the spacecraft, all this shrapnel that's getting in there. And so they found they were getting the same effect on the International Space Station. This was back in 2002. And obviously they had to put additional layerings of polyethylene there just to absorb the secondary radiation. It says something about what we could have been expecting on Apollo, especially during the solar flares or passage through the Van Allen belt with all this aluminium shielding on the craft, supposedly shielding, I say that in quotation marks there, because we found out this is going to make the hazard much even worse than it was without the aluminium. Let me actually start, because there's actually 2 appropriate quotes for this, what I really want to talk about tonight. There's 2 appropriate quotes. One is, "Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me." Another appropriate quote that I think is very relevant to bring up is this one by Steve Maboli. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. "I'm not crying because of you. You're not worth it. I'm crying because my delusion of who you were was shattered by the truth of who you are." I am, of course, talking about Elon Musk and SpaceX as a whole. When I was young, I dreamed of becoming an astronaut, dreamed of going to Mars, and then, of course, I had all my dreams shattered when I learned about the Apollo moon landing hoax, because like we can't solve this radiation hazard, or how are we going to get to the moon, how are we going to get to Mars with all these solar flares and the Van Allen belts and whatnot. In the 2000s, the private space industry really started to boom, and SpaceX in particular, particularly in the 2010s, they started making all these elaborate proposals. Now, Tom Marcuszek, he unveiled the next generation SpaceX rockets. This was on July 28, 2010 AIAA Joint Propulsion Conference. He had this entire slide showing all these future rockets, which were comparable in size to the Saturn V. And the largest rocket that he had proposed was the Falcon 20. That's what they were calling it there. It was about 10 meters wide. It was over 100 meters tall. And they were proposing 6 Merlin 2 engines in the first stage. Now, they said that you could launch 140 tons to Earth orbit with this kind of rocket. Elon Musk himself went on the record to say that the payload to the moon will be about 30 to 35% than it is to Earth orbit. And similarly to Mars, it'll be something like 25% of the payload to Earth orbit. Okay, and so when you do the calculations, if it's 140 tons to Earth orbit, then to the moon, that payload will be 45 tons. And they were basically proposing that the second stage would double as the Earth departure stage in this thing. Now, that was in 2010. A year later, they unveiled what they called the Red Dragon, which was basically this proposal to land the Dragon propulsively. Here's something that I always wondered. I wonder if they actually read Ralph Renee's book, because Renee, he had his doubts about the Viking and the Pathfinder landers. He didn't believe that the parachutes would have, performed the job correctly in the low-density Martian atmosphere. Interestingly enough, SpaceX, they proposed ditching the parachutes altogether and just use propulsive landings, use the spacecraft's own Super Draco launch abort thrusters to make the propulsive landing all the way down to the surface of Mars. And so that really got me thinking right there. Now, a year later, and we're in 2012 now, Elon Musk appears on Scott's Legacy on the BBC radio on March 15, 2012, and he basically says that in 10 or 15 years, they will be flying astronauts to Mars at only $500,000 per person. Now, in that same interview, he mentioned that the radiation hazard was such that you would need a column of water between the sun and the crew. He's obviously talking about going to Mars here, but he also says, anyone wants to go to the moon, we'll take them there. We'll just drop them off on the way. That's a direct quote. Having seen this interview, I did some calculations and some estimates on my own, and knowing what I knew about the proposals and what all these rockets that they're proposing to build and whatnot, an idea on how to actually solve the radiation hazard for real and get us to the moon and Mars. My theories considered a Red Dragon spacecraft as the lander, a living quarters, which was much more space for people to live and work in, similar in size and proportions to the Kibo laboratory on the ISS, and a spherical shelter module surrounded by 2 meters of water. So the Dragon was about 6 tons, the living quarters was about 16 tons, and the shelter module with all this water would have been about 109 tons for a total mass of 131 tons. This concept, I must emphasize as well, assumes lunar or Mars surface rendezvous. What that means is that the spacecraft lands on the surface of the moon or the surface of Mars close to a previously landed spacecraft with all the return propellants aboard. So that way you keep the weight down as you're trying to get down to the surface of the moon or the surface of Mars, whichever. And then basically once you've landed there, you refill up the tanks on the surface, launch back up into orbit. To lift such a spacecraft, I theorized that they could use a Falcon Heavy equivalent of the Falcon 20. So basically, you got a Falcon 20 rocket with 2 additional first stages of side boosters, which would roughly triple the lifting capacity. I did the calculations. On paper, it looked very feasible. I suddenly had this newfound hope for realizing my dreams of going to Mars, becoming an astronaut and all this. And spoiler alert, in the long run, it turned out to be false hope. Now, I did my calculations, I did my estimates, and I published a video along those lines on April 25th in 2012. A couple months later, in June of 2012, a private organization called Mars One, they unveiled their own plans for one-way trips to Mars and setting up a permanent civilization. Interestingly enough, their proposal was almost virtually identical to what I had theorized in my video released 2 months earlier. Theirs was much more scaled down. They were basically considering exactly the same thing. They were considering a Red Dragon lander and a living quarters, but they were proposing to send it with Falcon 9 Heavy, the much smaller rocket, the Falcon 9 rocket with 2 additional first stages of side boost. They were proposing to use that to send their one-way trips to Mars. They were estimating they could get there by 2023. The reason why they were considering the smaller rockets was because they had underestimated the shielding capacity. Even though they were proposing to bury the habitat under tons of Martian soil, they reckoned that only 20 grams per square centimeter of shielding would have been needed on the trip there to Mars, which obviously that's wrong. The mistakenly accepted position seems to be, if it works for the International Space Station, it must surely work on a trip to Mars or the moon or wherever. They just seem to think space is space for some reason. It blows your mind. Now, in October of that same year, we're still in 2012, Musk had announced plans for a new rocket called MCT. Now, this is where it was getting confusing because he would use the terms rocket and spacecraft interchangeably as if they were the same thing. So a lot of people were speculating as to what kind of vehicle he was proposing. Was he proposing a spacecraft or was he proposing a new heavy-lift rocket? Now, this rocket, which was called MCT, a lot of people theorize that MCT stood for Mars Colonial Transporter or something along those lines, or Mars Crew Transport or something. Now, that same month, Gwen Shotwell of SpaceX, she was saying that this rocket had a lifting capacity between 150 tons to 200 tons to Earth orbit. Okay, so this was slightly higher than what was originally proposed for Falcon 20. Everything was looking so promising. Then on November 16th, Musk gave an interview and a speech before the Royal Astronomical Society in England. Okay, and Space.com quoted him as saying that they were ruling out Red Dragon as being the craft to land humans on Mars, stating that you just land the entire thing. And when asked for clarification if the entire thing meant the MCT, he replied, maybe. Now, in the same speech, Musk further clarified what he considered necessary to shield the astronauts from the radiation on the flight to Mars. This is a direct quote. He said, in terms of radiation shielding against a solar storm, sometimes that problem is stated that you need several meters of water to shield yourself, and then somebody does the calculations for a volume of a sphere, and that ends up being some enormous quantity of water. But you don't need to have that. You can just have a column of water pointed to the sun and make sure you mostly stay in front of that column. Now, when I heard that, I felt the weight of the world just literally crush me, because this was the direct antithesis of my position. This was basically a common misconception that I had spent the last, 10 or so years trying to debunk. You might remember that documentary where Jim Oberg was quoted as saying, we just point the bulky end of the Apollo spacecraft towards the incoming radiation from the sun, and that will keep them safe from a solar flare. Well, that's not going to work, because the solar flares, they fall along magnetic field lines and they traveled off in all directions. Even if the solar flare is pointed away from the Earth, the magnetic field lines will carry the particles towards the Earth, and basically you need to have shielding on all sides of the spacecraft. Now, I did a follow-up video basically showing that what he's proposing wasn't going to work, and in fact, I actually cited a historical example. It was a very recent example at the time. On January 27, 2012, there was a solar flare that was fired away from both the Earth and Mars, and yet the solar particles from that flare was detected by the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter and various near-Earth satellites. So that's demonstrated the fact that the solar flares were being carried off in all directions by the magnetic field. So I produced that follow-up video, and I sent links to it on Elon Musk's Twitter account. I sent him messages, I sent him links to the articles I had cited, I sent him links to the videos I produced. He didn't acknowledge reception or anything. The following year, 2013, Musk basically revealed that MCT did indeed stand for Mars Colonial Transporter, and he narrowed it down basically to being the spacecraft. His statements was, no near plans for IPO at SpaceX, only possible in very long term when Mars Colonial Transporter is flying regularly. The following year, now we're in 2014, Elon Musk was interviewed by Joseph Gordon-Levitt, and he unveiled some more details as to his Mars plans. He said the MCT would carry 100 people per trip, and that the spacecraft that will land on Mars will be 100 times the size of a large SUV. And so, okay, we're getting a bit more elaborate now. The following month, on February 3rd, Musk told CBS This Morning, we need to develop a much larger vehicle, which will be the sort of what I call a large colonial transport system. We're talking about rockets on a bigger scale than anyone has ever built before that would make the Apollo moon rocket look small. They launch very frequently as well. That's what's needed to send millions of people and millions of tons of cargo to Mars. Now, the following month, in March 7, NASA Spaceflight, they published an article titled SpaceX Advances Drive for Mars via Raptor Power. Now, here's where the original proposals for Falcon 20 started to go out the window. The article opens with, SpaceX co-founder and vice president of propulsion Tom Mueller has revealed that the company is deep into the development of the first full-flow methane liquid oxygen rocket engine, known as the Raptor. 9 of these immensely powerful engines on 1 or 3 cores, like what I theorized, will be utilized to send SpaceX's super heavy lift launch vehicle uphill on missions to Mars. The article then states that Mueller confirmed 9 of these engines would power each 10-meter diameter core on the notional MCT. I'm quite proud to have my name attached to this engine, said the SpaceX co-founder of the event. And so this article, it seemed to vindicate my theory that a Falcon 20 Heavy was on the cards. They'd also make comparisons, rather, to Vladimir Shalomov's UR-700M rockets, because these were basically, in the old Soviet Union days, they didn't have any equivalent to NASA. They just had different bureaus competing for design contracts. Obviously, we're all familiar with the N-1 rocket. Well, that wasn't their only plan to send people to the moon. The other plan was by the bureau of Vladimir Shalomov. His proposal was the UR-700, which was basically, it was shorter than the Saturn, but it had made up for in all these different cores it had strapped around it. It had something like 6 or 7 cores strapped around the main core, right? And it would cross-feed all the engines. And basically, so once these cores jettisoned, the central core would still be completely full of propellant. And so that thing could lift up to 150 tons to the moon. He was proposing direct ascent missions, of course. That was in NASA's spaceflight article. In that same month, Glenn Shotwell was interviewed by the Space Show with Mark Livingston, and he asked her specifically about the Falcon 20 rocket. He asked her, where will they be launching from? To which she responded, Oh, you mean the Mars? The really big ones? Basically, like she's just slipped up on camera as if she was trying to keep this a secret as what they're trying to build and stuff. Even though they've unveiled it back in 2010, they're trying to make it all a huge secret, so it seems. Well, that was the original proposal that ultimately became Starship as we know it today. But of course, what was proposed back in 2010 and what was ultimately delivered was drastically different. Anyways, based on all this information they had unveiled, I had basically revised my theories accordingly. When he says there would be 100 times the size of a large SUV, this is the spacecraft, I basically did the calculations. That ended up being something like 2,240 cubic meters. By comparison, a Boeing 767 has only a cabin volume of about 486 cubic meters. To enlarge the radiation shield for 100 people, that would bring the mass up to about 180.7 tons just for the radiation shield. And so the entire spacecraft ends up being something like 422 tons. To lift that to the moon and Mars, I basically theorized a UR-700 equivalent of the Falcon 20, with 7 first stages of side boosters attached to around the main central core, just to lift all this extra mass of the shielding. We get to 2016 now. Elon Musk unveils his plans at the 2016 International Astronomical Conference. The Mars Colonial Transport at this point has been renamed the Interplanetary Transport System, and it consists of a 2-stage rocket with the upper stage doubling as the lander. But here's where the wheels started to come off, because during the Q&A conference, this is Musk, he reiterated his false claim that only a column of water pointed to the sun was necessary to shield the astronauts from the radiation en route. And as if to further illustrate his cavalier attitude to the radiation, while he was making these ridiculous statements, he's literally standing in front of a slide showing his astronauts walking around on the surface of Jupiter's moon Europa. That's literally face-palm inducing because the moon Europa actually lives in Jupiter's radiation belt. Okay, so literally you're depicting people walking around in spacesuits. In literally minutes to hours, they're all going to be fatally exposed to a lethal dose of radiation. The Van Allen radiation belt of Jupiter is much more intense than the radiation belt of the Earth. Another indication that he had underestimated what would have been required was, for whatever reason, one of his slides depicts his spacecraft using solar panels out by Saturn. Oh my God, this just completely boggles the mind because the Saturn only receives about 1/100th of the solar flux of the Earth. So at Earth, his solar panels produce about 200 kilowatts of power. That means by the time they get out to Saturn, they're only producing about 2 kilowatts. For comparison, the Juno spacecraft to Jupiter, it used enlarged solar panels which produced about 12 kilowatts of power at the Earth and only 186 watts at Jupiter. The Apollo spacecraft, they had 3 1.4 kilowatt fuel cells. The shuttle has 3 12 kilowatt fuel cells. That's to keep the astronauts alive for like 2 to 3 weeks. You know, you'd want to talk about using solar panels out by Saturn with only 2 kilowatts of power. You got to be crazy. You know, usually the preferred method for powering spacecrafts in the outer solar system, you know, things like Galileo, Cassini, and the Voyagers and New Horizons, they use radioisotopes, you know, a miniature nuclear power station. If you were to go out to Saturn or Jupiter, look towards the sun, it would just appear as a tiny little bright star. That's how the sun would appear out at these gas giants. That puts it into perspective. Seeing this video, I produced a follow-up video basically provocatively titled, "The Interplanetary Transport System Will Kill You," which I reiterated all these problems with the putting a column of water at the sun, why that's not going to work, you know, had to explain it again. Now, the following year, 2017, Elon Musk, he actually appears at the International Space Station R&D conference on July 19. He's in a Q&A session, and he obviously finally saw my video because he literally says this, and this is a direct quote. "One of the things I learned recently I didn't quite understand is that I always thought of the particles from the sun as going straight at you from the sun, but they follow the magnetic field lines. So you actually get some particles coming at you from the side, even though it's kind of an orthogonal direction from the sun. So you need some protection on at least 4 or 5 sides." He was literally quoting everything that I said in the videos that I sent him. He didn't acknowledge me by name. That'll look pretty good in a space.com article, wouldn't it? "Oh, the grandson of the moon landing hoax theory told me that my shield is not going to work. I need to do it this way, not that way." Obviously, he wasn't going to name me, obviously, but it is what it is. Anyways, he then unveiled in September, he unveiled a revised, scaled-back version of the Interplanetary Transport System. It was renamed Big Falcon Rocket, or BFR, and chief among the changes, he said it has a solar storm shelter. That same year, he was proposing the first cargo missions would land on Mars in 2022, and the first human missions would land in 2024. Years went by, and I was waiting in all these different conferences that appeared, all these different speeches he did, waiting for him to unveil more details about the solar storm shelter. What could it possibly consist of? But with each revision of the Starship, it would get progressively smaller and smaller and scaled back. And it got to the point where the only realistic way I could see, to keep the astronauts shielded would have been to either put the shelter cabin, inside, surround it by the actual propellant tanks, so use the propellants as a makeshift radiation shield, because he's got a header tank for the landing missions, basically in the forward section, tanks in the aft, obviously. The only other option would be to use the tanks forward, the tanks back, and thicken the walls between those tanks accordingly, such that it would be equivalent to several meters of water. I got this for demonstration purposes here. This here is a 1 meter ruler. Okay, so the stainless steel equivalent of 2 meters of water would be about that long, about 25 centimeters. Okay, that's how much steel you would need to get the equivalent of 2 meters of water shielding against the radiation. Knowing what I know now, I actually regret making my theories about how to solve the radiation hazard with SpaceX technology, because I regretfully came to the conclusion that Elon Musk probably just made the whole thing up about the solar storm shelter to appease his critics and potential customers. Obviously, it gave me false hope. In 2001, NASA was looking for 3 contractors for the Artemis program, the Human Landing System, as they called it, the HLS. The 3 contractors considered were General Dynetics, SpaceX, and Blue Origin. Now, at this stage, both General Dynetics and Blue Origin had unveiled their engineering mock-ups of their respective landers, and both of which were similar in size to the Apollo Lunar Module or the LK-700 concept. But SpaceX, on the other hand, they were consistently crashing and blowing up their prototypes of the Starship. In an act that can only be described as corporate sabotage and corporate espionage, during the vacancy of the Office of NASA Administrator between November 9th, 2020 and May 3rd, 2021, a NASA employee by the name of Kathy Leaders announced on April 16th, 2021 that she alone had selected SpaceX's Starship as the sole contractor of NASA's HLS vehicle. Shortly after publishing this document, she resigned from NASA and then got a cushy job at SpaceX. 2 minutes shows you all you need to know. Their contract was written that the SpaceX would do the Artemis 3 mission. It would land on the moon in the first quarter of 2025, right? And sometime before that, they would need to do an unmanned demo mission to land on the moon with the Starship thing. And well, the thing didn't launch until April 20th of 2023. We all saw that launch. It was catastrophic. The vehicle suffered multiple engine failures, multiple engines. They just died left, right, and center. And it became apparent that the SpaceX commentators were actually just reading off a script and pushing some outright lies, which were in direct contradiction to what we see on screen. The most obvious is when they called out the max Q, when it is clear that the rocket isn't traveling fast enough, given all the engine failures it had. Now, not only did many of the engines die, the second stage failed to separate. The spacecraft self-destruct system itself failed, which basically left the vehicle spinning out of control until it finally just got shredded apart by the aerodynamic forces. And as if to demonstrate utter stupidity, SpaceX didn't even have the foresight to put a flame trench underneath the Starship's launch gantry, and we all saw what happened. It carved a gigantic crater in the ground and scattered rocks and pulverized concrete all over the launch site, causing huge amounts of damage. Now, the second Starship launch was in November of that same year, November 18. That one successfully managed to separate. It had a stage separation, but the lower stage blew up, and then the upper stage exploded. Now, this is further indication that they're all just reading off a script here. When the Starship exploded, it had almost no propellant left in the tanks, right? And it exploded at about 8 minutes and 6 seconds into the thing. Now, at the time of the explosion, the Starship was only traveling at about 24,000 kilometers per hour at an altitude of 148 kilometers. Now, for comparison, the minimum velocity for a spacecraft to achieve a stable orbit around the Earth is 28,100 kilometers per hour. Okay, now, despite clearly blowing up on screen, the SpaceX commentators stuck to their script, basically talking as if the spacecraft was still heading to a nominal trajectory. In the control room, you can see the conditions trying in vain to reestablish the signal. And it's not until about 11 minutes and 20 seconds, or some 3 minutes and 14 seconds after the vehicle exploded, did the commentators finally confirm that it blew up. SpaceX knew, in particular Elon Musk, he knew that he would be facing criminal proceedings because he pretty much squandered all of NASA's budget for the HLS contract, but now he's also facing potential lawsuits from the EPA for all the environmental damage his Starship explosions caused to the surrounding area. And there's all kinds of endangered species of birds and things there, living in this region. And then there's the FAA, who has him under investigation of all these flagrant safety violations, committed with these launches. But this is my own opinion, but I think it's 100% accurate. To stay out of jail, Elon Musk basically purchased Twitter, renamed it X, and turned it into a propaganda cesspit, pushing all kinds of disinformation and pro-Trump propaganda. Basically, his idea was he would get Trump reelected, who in turn will give him a cushy job in the government to basically give him a position of power to make all his legal troubles go away. Now, the third Starship launch, we saw what happened there. That one also managed to reach stage separation. Right now, the problem started when they opened up the Pez dispenser door, which is what they call the door to release satellites. They call it Pez dispenser. You might remember those candies where you pull back on the head and the little pellet of candy pops out. The idea is the same concept. You open the door and these, all the different satellites they would shoot out. They were trying to test this door, but here's the thing. They obviously didn't have the foresight to vent out the spacecraft. They thought this was obvious, to depressurize the cabin before opening the door, because as soon as the door opens, you can actually see it in the footage. It bent the door, crumpled inwards, and it caused the spacecraft, the release of gas caused the spacecraft to start spinning out of control, a la Gemini 8. Now, you can see as well as that when the spacecraft burns the tanks to completion, and they say engine cutoff, the commentators, they call out Starship nominal orbit insertion, despite the spacecraft traveling at only 26,000 kilometers per hour, well below orbital velocity. And just to put this into further perspective, the spacecraft was supposed to splash down off the coast of Western Australia. Instead, it ended up off the coast of Madagascar, which demonstrates obviously it fell way short of its target. And the two subsequent flights, they both managed to make splashdown but exploded shortly afterwards. But in either case, you can tell from the on-screen velocity thing that it's nowhere near reaching orbital velocity, and that's despite the tanks being run dry of fuel. This is what really is both depressing and just mind-boggling, because if you actually take the Tsiolkovsky equation, the rocket thrust equation that we actually use to calculate how fast a rocket can travel, right, when you take the exhaust velocity of LOX and methane, okay, that's about 3.6 kilometers per second. Okay, multiply that by the natural log of the initial mass of the rocket over the final mass of the rocket, okay, which is something like 4.5 million kilograms over 100,000 kilograms. Okay, when you do the calculations, right, you end up getting something close to 50,000 kilometers per hour, which is more than enough to take it to escape velocity, right? And yet it fails to reach orbital velocity, which can only mean two things. One, SpaceX has exaggerated about the amount of propellant that the Starship and the Super Heavy are carrying, or option two, which is much more likely, is that the Raptor engines are inadequate for the mission. Remember, they were proposing to only have something like 9 Raptor engines in the beginning. Now they had something like 33 Raptor engines. As soon as you see the plumes change from orange to green, you know that the Raptors are cannibalizing themselves. It's basically burning away the stainless steel they're composed of, and that's mixing with the LOX methane plumes. So the long and short of it is that basically I was disillusioned by NASA with their fake moon landings. I looked at SpaceX with hope, stars in my eyes. I felt, okay, this is the miracle we've been waiting for. This is the solution to the problem. And here I am disillusioned yet again. As I said in the beginning, I'm not crying because of Elon Musk is not worth it. I'm crying because my delusion of who he was shattered by the truth of who he actually is. And he's made his true colors perfectly clear. He was never about the advancement of mankind and the benefit of science or this or that. It was never about that. All he wanted was basically whatever money he could get from NASA or anyone else who would pay him contracts for spaceflight. And basically, he wanted to be an oligarch, which is what he is now.
Yes, well, when you were speaking about him earlier, all I could think about is, gee, he wouldn't even be able to schedule school buses.
Especially not with the ones that keep blowing up on him.
This is impressive. I see what you mean, because I'm watching it right now. The third one, that's this one that just blew up recently here. Look at the rocket. One of the stabilizers is going in and out, and then it comes back in again. Then all of a sudden, now you start to see the colors change to a glowing purplish to glowing red. And then all of a sudden, the ship's gone, just poof.
I will say as well, the two latest ones that have just been launched, which blew up, right? Obviously, Musk was going to be under investigation for that. And as his new position as the head of Doge, his first movement is to bring those investigations against him to a halt. Like I said, I'm just completely disillusioned again. I looked up to Elon Musk, and he basically demonstrated his true colors. True colors. True colors. True colors. True colors. True colors.